This is Pixelated Audio, episode 129, and you're listening to KGB.
Beware, Max, your naive enthusiasm. You are running with a pack of wolves who will do anything to keep what they have stolen from the people of Russia. When you get into trouble, and believe me, you will get into trouble, think of me. Imagine what I, with my legendary intuition, would have done to solve the problem. My intuition. You see me now, Max, as I live on in your memory, before your mother and I were blown to pieces in that booby-trapped car. So much for my intuition, huh? One last thing. Buried somewhere beneath all the corruption is an ideal that many millions of honest people believed in. They may be fools, but they deserve the truth. Find it for them, Max.
All right, you're listening to Pixelated Audio, a podcast focusing on game audio, its history, and the people behind it. We're your hosts. I'm Gene, and this is Brian, and we've got a fun show today.
Yes, today we are going to be listening to music from KGB, a point-and-click adventure for both IBM PCs on DOS and the Commodore Amiga. It was primarily composed by Stéphane Picq, with the Amiga conversion done by Alexandre Ekian. That clip that brought us in. So we didn't start with the track because it was just, this game doesn't have a lot of music. There's only a few tracks in here.
They're very long tracks, but there's only a few of them.
Yeah, so we got plenty of music. But we had to start with that because it's your father speaking to you kind of in the intro of the game. He's kind of giving you his I guess fatherly advice on what to do from his like ghostly past or something.
Yeah, from the great beyond.
yes. It's such I love the whole blown to bits from a booby trap car part, but
bit of a weird take on talking to you from after his death, but it's fine.
Yeah.
Donald Sutherland puts in a good performance.
Yeah. How they got him to do this game, I'm not sure, but the more I hear that clip, the more I'm like, yeah, I dig it. There's a little bit of parts in there that I can't tell if he's being sarcastic or it's like it's his acting or he kind of slips out of character if he's not quite sure.
Yeah, well, we had to listen to it a lot, and I agree with you. I started to get really fond of it, and I wanted to make sure we kept it in.
Yeah. So, Gene, you have been asking us to cover KGB for a long time. I mean, I was never going to say no. The soundtrack is great. Love the artist. I think we have a lot of fun stuff to talk about. What grabbed you about the soundtrack?
Well, I've got a reputation to uphold, as the Russian host on
the token Rush guy. Russian guy.
Well, part of it was that because I actually had never heard of this game growing up, like at all. I was pretty familiar with a lot of DOS games growing up. I knew about Dune. I never played it, and
I played Dune, so this was like, I guess, my blind side as well, my blind spot.
The reason why I picked this one is, number one, it lives in the shadow of Dune, which also has an amazing soundtrack by Stéphane Picq. And when I discovered his music either through Dune or Lost Eden, I went back and started listening to everything else that he had done. And, if you go on YouTube, you'll see that this has a lot of listens. But it's not a game that gets talked about a whole lot, either as a game or as a soundtrack, but it's definitely worth listening to, and I wanted to cover it, and I feel like we could make a relatively lightweight, fun show out of it.
The topic in general is pretty interesting. There's not a whole lot of games that follow this kind of storyline and this kind of background, and that's a lot of it has to do with the developer and some choices that were put into making this game and some of the ideas to make it something that they thought maybe at the time would be successful. Now, whether or not it was is kind of up for debate. And I think the debate is mostly leaning on the it wasn't side, but I think there's some good in this game, some fun in it. So let's jump right in. KGB is a point-and-click adventure. I mentioned that before, that takes place in Russia, or rather the USSR Some of us will remember when it was called that. In the summer of 1991, shortly before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Again, it came out for DOS and Amiga in 1992, and it was published by Virgin Games and developed by Cryo Interactive Entertainment.
And we're going to talk about them in a bit, but let's first jump into some music. The track that we're going to start with is Burokrat, composed by Stéphane Picq, and we're mostly going to be focusing on the OPL2 or Adlib version of the soundtrack.
Okay, that was the OPL2 version of Burokrat, composed by Stéphane Picq for KGB on the IBM PC.
I feel like that track has a very suspicious energy.
Well, I mean, the game is all about kind of espionage, internal conflict, and so I think it does a real good job at alluding to the mystery that surrounds the internals or the corruption inside the KGB. And so I think Picq really hit the nail on the head here with having this kind of dark and almost like
it's kind of a tension that's not like it's uncomfortable, but it's more like what's going to happen. It feels
like spy kind of games to me, like almost like I don't know, keeping you at the edge of your seat, just waiting for that next thing, the guy to just pop out. And
there's a lot of cool little effects once he establishes the groove in this track, and that's pretty consistent throughout the soundtrack. And I just love all of the little just clever programming.
Right. I don't want to get too much into the OPL2 on this episode because we want to keep it light. There's not a ton of tracks. But real quick, it's a 2-operator mono FM synthesis chip, also known as the YM3812. It's the second in the line of the FM operator type L line. It's got 9 channels or 9 voices that it can play simultaneously. Each has its own ADSR envelope generator, and there is a percussion mode that you can enable that will give you 5 channels of percussion. I think there's I'm losing on this. It's bass, snare, toms, hats, and cymbals. Yeah. So you can use 6 melodic voices and then that percussion line. Picq doesn't use any of the percussion because he's very much into these kind of otherworldly sounds and having a lot of kind of ambience and percussion in his music. He writes everything himself, and I think that's what defines him as a musician, really kind of exploring these different instruments and making something that sounds really, really unique. I really like the style, and I think we're going to hear more of this as we get through the show.
Yeah, and as we'll talk about later, he was super into sound design and synthesis, so it's not really surprising to me that he would want a custom tweak. And we'll talk about the sound driver in this in a later section, but it's really cool stuff.
Yeah. So I don't know, have we talked about Cryo on this
Not
show?
really.
I don't believe so.
Not in any real depth, no.
Yeah, so Cryo is a French game studio, and so they released KGB and had Virgin Games publish it on both Amiga and DOS in 92, collectively in the UK, US, Germany, and Argentina, of all places. And it was later re-released on CD-ROM under the name Conspiracy for IBM PCs in 93 and 94, more widely in the US, UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain.
Yeah, now Cryo is a kind of interesting company, and since we don't talk about French devs too often on our show, I wanted to go back even a little bit further to talk about an earlier company called ERE Informatique to set the stage. So ERE Informatique was one of the first French video game companies. They were founded in 1983 by Emmanuel Viau, and a year later, Philippe Ulrich joined the team. In the earliest days of the company, they hired freelance game programmers that then received royalties for their games. It was a fairly common practice for game companies in those days.
I think that they only did freelance game programmers, right? They didn't actually have a staff of programmers in the research that I was looking at.
I don't think so with ERE. And I remember EA also did something very similar to that. That's why I this didn't surprise me when I read that.
Right.
Their first games were published for the Amstrad CPC, the ZX Spectrum, and the Auric home computers, which was a British home computer, pretty much only popular in the UK and France. I had never really heard of it before this episode. And their first big hit was Macadam Bumper. It was a pinball simulator game programmed by Remi Herbulot, who was a self-taught programmer, and that's a name that's going to become more important throughout the show. They also created the game Bubble Ghost in 1987. It was a minor hit, but it was published on a lot of platforms, including the Game Boy in 1990, so you might have played that one possibly.
Never heard of either of those.
In general, ERE didn't have a lot of worldwide hits. So in 1988, ERE created their Exos label. It was designed to put out original stories based on science fiction worlds. This was during that era of popular science fiction like Blade Runner, H.R. Giger stuff, Alien. There was a 70s French magazine called Metal Hurlant. It was basically the equivalent of
Heavy Metal
magazine in the US. It actually came out a few years before that.
Which is crazy because I thought the Heavy Metal magazine was like a very American kind of thing, or it was actually Canadian, right? Something like that. But
I think it was American, but I was surprised that Metal Hurlant, which is called Howling Metal or Screaming Metal in English, came out in 1974. So it was it was like a solid 3 years before Heavy Metal. It was like 1977. And if you're not familiar with those, just think of like prog rock album covers, silver metal people, Beastmen, Star Wars, that whole era of
like
fantasy
anything
sci-fi.
From like Iron Maiden, like in fact, if you haven't seen the Heavy Metal movie, go watch that. It's so bizarre and strange and so kind of oddly French, I think, actually. There's some
the cover of that is a lady in a bikini riding a dragon. That's basically all you need to know about the art style that was popular at the time. So
there was a game called Heavy Metal too, and I think for the Dreamcast, right? I think it was Heavy Metal for Dreamcast.
Don't know. It seems like a common enough title. Well, anyway, let me finish up with the Exos stuff. So, Exos produced probably ERE's only really notable games. They produced Cult, The Temple of Flying Saucers, and Captain Blood. They're both really weird biomechanical games and very French. Yes, Captain Blood is especially weird. Like, you fly around the galaxy looking to kill your own clones to regain your power, but at the same time, you communicate with aliens using pictographs. It's like a prototype for Star Control, but less humorous and more just like surreal, I guess.
These games were very strange. So I had never heard of either one of them until we started looking into this. And I think we were just talking about it the other night. Like, there's something about like the art style and the imagery that they're trying to depict. It's like this really kind of like strange. It's almost like a dystopian future, but also with like some weird kind of Alice in Wonderland type surrealism kind of aspects to it. I don't know how to explain it. It's just it's uncomfortable and kind of gross, but like at the same time really cool.
Yeah, I've watched enough French media at this point to know that there's something that has to do with like sex and existentialism at all times. I don't really get it. I didn't grow up in that culture, but there's just something that kind of permeates the French media, games, movies, comic books. I can't quite put my finger on it. Well, anyway, just to wrap up this section, ERE, like a lot of early game companies, they had some financial problems. So in June of 1987, they were acquired by Infogrames, which was a massive French games publisher. And
that we've absolutely talked about before.
Yeah, I'm sure they've come up a few times. And ERE operated for a little bit more independently, their Exos label. But eventually a number of employees either quit or were laid off, and that's when they joined together to form Cryo.
Yes, so Cryo began unofficially in 1989 and formally incorporated as Cryo Interactive Entertainment in 1990 in Paris, France. It was founded by Philippe Ulrich, Remi Herbulot, and Jean-Marcel Lafranc. Their first game, Ecstasy, was released in 1990, but their big break was in 1992 with the release of Dune, a first-person adventure game based on the Frank Herbert novel, and the in-game graphics borrowed heavily from the 1984 David Lynch film. And to this day, it's still probably their best-known game, especially outside of France. I mean, I hadn't heard pretty much of anything else and except for Dune, and everybody knows Dune, I think, in the gaming scene.
For me, it was basically the soundtracks, and I knew Dune just because when the movie came out,
right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was known as like a really ambitious science fiction film or a total flop in the theaters. It kind of had this cult ethos around it. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, what's crazy is that Dune came out in 92, which was a pretty ambitious title compared to what they had done before. But KGB was also released in 1992, but it didn't make as big of a splash since it was fictitious, but it was based in that realistic setting. And I think that just people weren't as eating that content up as much as the sci-fi at the time.
See, I don't get that because the Star Wars prequel trilogy showed that kids love political turmoil. They love hearing about trade deals and, like what's going on with one government faction versus another. So this game should have been a surefire hit.
Right. And it's crazy because it borrowed the same game engine and the music engine. So there's a lot of similarities between KGB and Dune Under the Hood, but they just just took a completely different approach to how to grab the audience, I guess. Other notable titles that Cryo did was the Mega Race series. So that's a popular one. I wouldn't say it's as popular as Dune. And I think a lot of Mega Race's popularity came from the fact that it was installed on a lot of PCs. There was a period of time when Windows 95 was released that was it 95 or 3.1 that Mega Race was just bundled in software. And
probably
so
was 3. Actually, it could have been either. I don't remember.
I want to say it was 95, and I think it came. I think it came bundled in. I remember my friend had a Hewlett Packard or a Packard Bell machine, and I think it was bundled with that. So yeah, Mega Race, Lost Eden, and the Atlantis series.
Yeah, Cryo was mostly a PC developer. They occasionally had ports to other systems and consoles. Like a lot of stuff in those early days was for like Sega CD and Amiga. But in general, if you look at the history of games they developed, it was almost always PC first with, sometimes a port. Right. Oftentimes their games were 2D or 3D adventure games, like this one. And they did release games in other genres, but that was kind of their bread and butter. Right. And they'd often feature really highly fictionalized historical settings like this one, or ancient Greece, for example. Or their other trend was to do licensed properties like Dune, or they did a game based on Philip K. Dick's Ubik for the PS1, which I remember hearing about and then forgetting immediately after.
I have no idea. Yeah. And by the mid 90s, Cryo was a pretty sizable company. In addition to developing numerous games and stuff, they started working as a publisher. So unfortunately, a lot of their games were only moderately successful. So the company went bankrupt in 2002. But all in all, they developed and published about 80 different games in just over a decade.
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't surprise you that they folded when we've talked about they released 80 games, and even the stuff that they're known for is not that well known. So
exactly, yeah.
And as a fun little side note, early on in their history, they developed 2 games for the Super Nintendo, the advert game Super Danny and the licensed game Time Cop. They're not really notable games, but the music for both was composed by a David DeGrotola, better known as David Cage. Yes, everybody, that David Cage, the founder of Quantic Dream. They made Heavy Rain, Detroit Become Human, Fahrenheit before that. He's a bit of a polarizing game director, let's say, but he wrote the music for these 2 games. So if you want to blame anybody for his early success, blame Cryo Entertainment.
Right. Time Cop, man, that brings me back. I love that movie.
I didn't play that game, so I don't know much about it, but
I played it just a little bit because I like the movie, but I mean, I haven't watched the movie in probably like 20 years. So
it's super dumb, but it's pretty fun.
Oh, it's really dumb. Virgin Games. You want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, no, not really, but we'll go over them as quickly as possible. So Virgin Games was part of the massive British conglomerate known as Virgin Group. You've probably heard of them. It was founded by Richard Branson and Nick Powell. Virgin's involved in everything: airlines, retail, banking, music, gaming, lots and lots of other stuff. Virgin Games was founded in 1983, and it's changed a lot over the years. In 1993, they were Virgin Interactive Entertainment, later Avalon Interactive in 2003, which then went bankrupt in 2006. At one point in time, Virgin owned Westwood Studios, known for the Command & Conquer series, Legend of Carandia, and the other Dune series, which is a bunch of real-time strategy games.
Yes.
Same license, different style of game altogether.
Right.
Virgin was one of Europe's largest publishers, and they had a fairly large presence even in the U.S. I remember them from Beneath the Steel Sky, personally. I mean, from their games division.
Right. I mean, Virgin was basically the British Sony. Like they did like the same kind of thing, maybe even larger scale. Like they were a very big conglomerate of everything.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I bought a lot of albums that were by Virgin back in the day in the 90s. So their name was everywhere. And a lot of people know Richard Branson. He's a fairly he's a fairly notable CEO in that he's always making his face very visible. In any case,
we've gone on way too long. That's the longest block of talking because we're going to get into a lot more music.
We're going to shorten it down after this. And Virgin Games is still around today, but it's just used for their gambling division, similar to how Konami does. We keep ragging on them, but anyway,
they're not the only ones. Anyway.
That's about all we're going to do about talking about Virgin. They're not that interesting in the context of this show.
Yes. Let's get into our next track. This is Kursk, and this is also from the OPL2 version, composed by Stéphane Picq.
That was the OPL2 version of Kursk, composed by Stéphane Picq for KGB or Conspiracy.
There's a few different movements in this track that I think they repeat, but we're not actually playing a loop there. It's two kind of distinct sections that have altered versions later on. And I really like this because it starts off, all the music in this game isn't too, I don't want to say it's too busy sounding. I think what's interesting about it is the just diversity in the instrumentation and the kind of play on creating this kind of dark sound. Nothing inadvertently Russian about it, it's a lot more
hardly, yeah,
it's a lot more just very kind of dark and like just a little bit gritty, but with the very tribalistic kind of instruments to the percussion line.
You know what I love about this track is it's probably the most minimal song, in the sense it's like you have a lot of space to breathe. There's a lot of like openings, but it also really showcases just how expressive it can be. There's a lot of like morphing of sound patches, like changing the mid sound a lot closer to what you hear out of like subtractive synths of the day. Like you didn't hear this out of FM soundtracks too much.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of really interesting instruments. I mean, we've heard it already. We're going to hear more as we get through the soundtrack. He's a very worldly kind of person, but really trying to dissect and play individual channels is a challenge on this, and kind of hard to pinpoint because he really moves and kind of dances around the sound chip and what it can do and what FM can do on this chip. And so it's a very unique characteristic of this composer.
Yeah, and we talk about this from time to time. OPL2 is not a great sound chip in the sense that most people just didn't take the time to learn it, but he is pretty much one of the few masters that you can point to as really understanding how it works. So Stéphane Picq, we mentioned, he wrote the core of the soundtrack. He also worked on Cult, Temple of the Flying Saucers for ERE, that was a previous company, Ecstasy, which was Cryo's first official game in 1990, Dune, Mega Race, Commander Blood, that was a sequel to Captain Blood by ERE, Lost Eden, Atlantis, The Lost Tales.
Wait, they made a sequel? I didn't know this. They made a sequel to Captain Blood?
Yeah, it's called Commander Blood. It's got that terrible like mid-90s CG like pre-render stuff. Okay. I kind of prefer the abstract French first version versus the like bad game over cutscene like Chuck E. Cheese stuff. And I think his last game that he worked on officially was Riverworld, which was in 1998. And Stéphane Picq was similar to a lot of game musicians at the time. He started off as a programmer in 1983, coding games for the ZX Spectrum and Amstrad CPC. He started writing music mostly just as a hobby because he played with electric piano and analog synth, but most of his money was from porting games to other systems like the Amiga. And often the Amiga ports wouldn't have much sound and music, so he just started to add them on his own with tracker software. And while he was at ERE, people liked what he was doing enough, and he was asked to write music for their games, and soon that was his primary job. He became almost exclusively a music programmer.
Yes, so we did look up some personal information that he had on his personal website back in 1998 is when it kind of disappeared. But using archive.org, we were able to look back in the Wayback Machine, and he talks about some of his background. He's actually a really interesting guy. Here's a few quotes. It says, who am I? A composer born in 1965 and worked mainly for computer games since 1987. A guy fascinated by all kinds of altered states of consciousness music, mainly shamanic ritual music and techno trance, but also some sacred music and some meditative new age music. Also a human being, co-renter of this nice planet like you. So
very, very spiritual. We're all connected. We're all one.
Yeah, it's very interesting too, because the title of his website is "Who Am I? Who cares?" He's very much like kind of just saying like, it doesn't matter really who I am, but in case you wanted to know, here's a few little tidbits.
Yeah, it's this website. It was logged in 1998, and he mentions that I'm now living in Madagascar, trying to forget everything about computer games and having a completely different life. 10 years doing the same job is a very long time, and I think one must change sometimes. And he goes on and talks more about it, which I think is crazy, right? To just like pull up sticks and just be like, you know what, I'm going to go live in another country altogether.
Dude, I couldn't do that. Especially you think about something like that. You can tell from his music that he is very passionate about this kind of thing, right? He learned OPL2 and really like kind of mastered it. He really spent time developing his sound and this is not something you can just throw away, but he did. He was just like, I'm moving on. And he's got a ton of influences, like not every composer has this just oozing like culture. A lot of people say, oh, I was really into rock. I was really into maybe classical music, or maybe some Middle Eastern stuff. But his influences just list is amazing. It's Middle Eastern, African, Indian, Balinese, sacred music, new age, classical rock, metal, trash, blues, techno, trance, jungle, ambient. I mean, he lists some really, really cool stuff, different bands on his website.
Yeah, when some people say I listen to all music, I'm like, yeah, okay, sure. But when a guy like this says it, I believe it.
Yeah, I mean, he's probably just listening to this stuff right now, not knowing that we're talking about him while he's hanging out in Madagascar. Probably didn't even know the coronavirus thing happened.
Yeah, I'm sure he does. He has the internet, but I think he's still down there. And this is 20-something years later. And
oh yeah,
just to round it out, some of the bands he mentions very specifically. Keep in mind this was 1998. So Bjork, Brian Eno, Depeche Mode, Eric Satie. The piano composer, Kate Bush, Philip Glass, Vivaldi, Yes, and like 24 other bands. I mean, this guy truly, truly was a lover of music. That's
yes.
So evident.
Yeah, and one of our favorite quotes, he says, is if you feel shocked to see some of your favorite names, bands near others, which seem weird to you, remember that there are many musics for every moment of the day, multiplied by the number of different emotions you can feel, multiplied by the number of seasons, multiplied by the number of places you can listen to music. Even if I like techno trance, I would never come into my mind to listen to it on a beautiful beach in the south of India. That quote, I know it's funny because I think he's kind of playing a joke on us, or he's joking obviously that there's too much to say because I have an emotion and a mood and a minute and a second for everything I listen to, and it depends on that moment that really particular style or genre or what have you speaks to me. And I like that. I read that several times over and I just thought that's cool. It's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I think it captures a very cool idea that you could be listening to two different artists in the exact same place, one because you're sad and one because you're happy, and they're both appropriate, based on how you're feeling. So there's no reason why you have to limit what you listen to based on anything really arbitrary. But at the same time, some things, you mentioned I wouldn't listen to trance on a beautiful beach. I probably would, but there's a time and a place that fit the setting and the mood. It doesn't necessarily always, sometimes the place dictates what feels right, and other times it's more how you're feeling. I don't think it's a cool sentiment.
But why this guy worked so good with game audio is because I think that concept speaks a lot to people who listen to VGM, right? VGM isn't a genre. There's genres. We listen to all sorts of stuff, right? Like on this show, for example, we listen to classical, we listen to trance, we listen to country and kind of deep south blues. We listen to, the whole gamut, right? And I think that appreciating that, and a lot of people that listen to VGM podcasts, VGM can be in that same kind of mindset, depends on what you're into in that moment. That's why when people say what's your favorite, your favorite soundtrack, I can't pick because it doesn't work like that. It just doesn't work that way. And so I can really relate.
I mean, this soundtrack, totally. I mean, this is ambient electronic, which I love ambient electronic music, but it's rare to find a soundtrack that we'd be able to play on the show that would keep people's interest. But there's so many little things to grab onto that it's This is a little bit different, right? We're listening to these long tracks, these long ambient electronic tracks where we tend to prefer sometimes, like more upbeat, dancey kind of stuff. I mean, I still think this is something that a lot of people can enjoy. It is one of the reasons why I wanted to pick this, because soundtracks like this just don't come around very often.
Right.
I think it's good to highlight something like this where it's engaging and interesting and a little bit odd all at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, this guy, he's a very spiritual guy. He has a deep connection to music, and we're going to, listen to other soundtracks by him in the future for sure. I mean, there's not a lot, and we probably won't hear anything unless he decides to move away from Madagascar and get back. He's like 10 years in Madagascar, 20 years in Madagascar. I'm doing something else. What's he doing now? Like, he's in the rare jewel business, or
I think he was like
precious stones.
He was selling shells by the seashore. I actually don't know exactly what he was doing, but he wasn't doing music stuff. But I did see recently he was tapped for the Mega Race reboot, but I don't know if that's ever been finished.
Yeah.
So I think it was more like, I've been tapped for the project. If it ever comes to the point, I'll write the music for it. I think that was like 3 or 4 years ago, so I haven't seen any news.
Yeah, the guy's probably checked out.
He's doing fine. I've seen photos of him, and he looks like he's on a beach in like a Hawaiian shirt, just kind of chilling out,
Yeah. Exactly. Well, so we listened to a lot of OPL2 stuff so far, or a few tracks. The Amiga stuff actually has some really interesting sound. Like, we're going to primarily focus on the OPL2, but there is some interesting samples and stuff that are using the Amiga, and there's also a single track that is exclusive to the Amiga. When Alexandre Ekian ported over the sound, there is a track in here called Exxolove, or the main theme from KGB. So let's take a listen to that, and we'll be right back. Man, it's a really smooth track. I like it. It's not extremely exciting, but it just, I don't know, it hits a lot of the right notes for me. I like it.
Yeah, that pad sound really just, I feel it deep inside. I mean, going for a different thing than the Stéphane Picq tracks. It's a little bit more like 80s new wave, Tears
Right.
for Fears, but I really dig the track. That's not a slam on it, but like it's clear he's going for something else than what Stéphane Picq was going for, and that's Alexandre Ekian.
Yes. So there's only really 3 tracks on the Amiga release. A part of a 4th track.
It's like 40 seconds.
Yeah, something like that. The track you just heard was Exxolove, also known as KGB's main theme, and it was written using Star Trekker, which is a format or a tracker that is a sound tracker clone released by Exxolove or Bjorn Wesson of Fairlight in 1990. And essentially, it looks just like any other, sound tracker file or pro tracker even. But Exxolove, the title itself, if you can remember earlier on, we were talking about Exos was their
sci-fi,
their sci-fi name, and so kind of reusing that for this was a nice little throwback, I think.
Yeah, I think they got kind of attached to that whole Exos name. It kind of pops up in random little spots. Anyway, the composer, Alexandre Ekian, we don't really have that much info on him, but other than this game, he also did the Amiga version of Dune and the soundtrack for Super Burnout for the Atari Jaguar, which is definitely worth checking out. It's actually a really good soundtrack.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I couldn't find a whole lot on this guy, to be honest.
Yeah, in fact, on Stéphane Picq's website, that archived one, he actually gave a totally different name. Totally wrong. I think he just didn't really know,
Yeah, I think he wrote it as like Alex Abekian or something like that.
Yeah. Something just wrong. Anyways, KGB, we briefly touched on the story at the top of the show. It's summer of 1991, prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and you, the player, Maksim Rukov, are transferred suddenly to a new branch called the Department P, that's sole purpose is to investigate corruption and double agents or other possible treacherous acts within the KGB and bring them to light. A retired officer turned private detective ends up dead, and you're tasked with determining what connection exists between the officer's death and corruption within the department.
Yeah, and obviously there's a lot of twists and turns. You're sort of interrogating people. You can hide out and watch different things happening throughout the game. So you have to be somewhat stealthy or choose when you want to intervene in a conversation. A lot of conversations in this game.
Right. I mean, it's, it's not like you can't compare it to like a Lucas game or anything like a Scum game. You would get used to like animations and kind of moving your character around. This is a very still screen, almost interrogation kind of style. Nothing like
Monkey Island.
Nothing like Monkey Island. This is a game is a lot more serious. The entertainment is like you're reading a crime scene investigation novel. It's a lot more on that kind of sleuthy and dark double agent side.
Yeah, you're spending a lot of time piecing together what happened, and you got people that are onto you and all sorts of different folks that come in and out of the story, and it's hard to know if they're telling the truth. There's a lot of just trying to process of elimination, figure out who's involved in what ways. I didn't play through the whole game. One of the reasons why is that it's actually really tough. Like because it's based off of the Dune engine, it also has an in-game clock that advances for every action that you do. If you're waiting around, if you're talking to people, if you switch screens. The very first mission, it's like, Rukov, I need this report on my desk by 6 o'clock. It starts at 4 p.m. And like moving to one scene costs you 40 minutes. So if you make a mistake, if you ask the wrong question, if you terminate the investigation, if you don't find the information that you're looking for, you can lose in that very first 20 minutes of gameplay.
But at the same time, the time aspect plays an important, critical role in other things. Like there's one scene where you're kind of staking out an interaction between two of the characters in a park, and your character is goes to hide in a bush, right? To kind of like listen in on some kind of possible interaction. You see somebody, you hide, and then you advance the clock, and you advance that clock until that interaction takes place. You listen in, and then you observe what's going to happen. So that stakeout kind of and time factoring in is a critical part of the game, and actually I thought made the game seem pretty cool. Like not a lot of other games did that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people at this time are trying to figure out how to take advantage of like pseudo real time, right? Like the game clock progresses, and you can see how things change over time. I think nowadays it's relatively commonplace. You have day-night cycles and all that stuff. But at the time, I think it was a pretty cool gameplay concept. That said, if you go back and play it today, it's probably going to be pretty hard, and the chances that you're going to get a game over are really high. So make sure you've got a guide with you, save often. There's probably a spoiler-free walkthrough, or if you don't want to do that, just watch a playthrough. You'll probably get almost as much out of it.
I think the playthrough... so I watched one of the playthroughs, long plays on there, and it was like an hour or 2.5 hours, 3 hours,
something like that. Yeah,
people who know what they're doing, right, going through it. So not an incredibly long game. Gabriel Knight's way longer. If you're gonna pick one of the two, go Gabriel Knight. But I think it's worth it checking out. I mean, it's definitely a weird kind of niche subgenre within, like espionage, like spy espionage, point and click adventure regarding like the KGB. It's got its place for sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting adventure game footnote at the very least, and probably worth like watching like 10 minutes of gameplay to see if it's your kind of game.
Yeah, the scenery is a little bit bleak. It's not an enjoyable place to be. The offices that you walk through and different like guard stations and stuff, it's just all very much like, and I get it's just not a happy place that you would want to end up.
Yeah, it's not puppy dogs and rainbows. It's apartment buildings and bureaucratic offices.
Right. So that being said, let's move over to something that's a little more enjoyable, which is the soundtrack. This is Gorbi from the OPL 2, composed by Stéphane Picq.
That was the OPL2 version of Gorbi, composed by Stéphane Picq for KGB or Conspiracy. Ooh, love this tune.
This is we're going to have to definitely pull this one apart a little bit. The strange effects and like kind of Vocaloid sections, like just, again, it's like this trancey kind of techno, but it's not too up tempo. It's not invoking any sort of like panic. It's more of this like question, like this kind of fog or haze is in the air, and you're just kind of questioning everything around you. And I can appreciate the bizarre and experimentation that Picq is doing with the OPL2 here. I really like this track. It's a really good one.
Yeah, me too. I was looking this up because I was really curious how they got that Gorbachev sound, and initially I was like, maybe it is speech synthesis, but no, that's pure FM. They were just doing some clever programming to make it sound like it was a Vocaloid synth, and I can't think of any other game at this time that was doing stuff like that. I mean, maybe they were playing back 1-bit audio samples, but like using FM to simulate speech was super weird, but awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Every one of these tracks has, to me, what I would say these really satisfying bass tones. Like, just the bass lines are really deep and rich, and I just love how they kind of carry that through most of the game.
Yeah. No, I think so too. I mean, this track is very unique in this game, but the whole soundtrack is unique out of what we usually get from the OPL2 anyway. So it's just like kind of like the obscure of the obscure, I guess. And
yeah, this finally the OPL2 gets its chance to shine.
Yeah, I know, right? I know, I love it. So, anyways, this track, let's kind of tear this apart a little bit. I think there's some interesting stuff that we can kind of listen to and kind of bring to the foreground. So, again, there's no percussion mode in this track, so we can kind of just listen to each of the 9 FM channels together. This first one here, let's take a listen.
Low growl.
Yeah, I like that. Okay.
There's that bass line.
Yeah. Let's bring in the second channel here. So listen to this by itself here. That kick is so like deep, you almost don't hear it. It just adds this like almost heartbeat thud to the track.
And that top, I don't know what you'd call that. It's not really a snare, but
no,
it's just
like a snare bell.
Yeah, but it works well in the context of the track.
Here's channel 4.
Got some your metals there.
Ooh. That was that one I was curious about. What is this?
There's so many inventive sounds on this thing.
Ooh, listen to that. He really likes those runs. Very like brash.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good way to create movement throughout the track, literally, because it stays, I think, pretty much in the same chords, like the same 2 chords or so.
So here's, it looks like the last few channels, he seems to uses the, oh God. Well, that just like dismissed what I was about to say. Thing. So this is 7, 8, 9. Oh, it's like
like a little breath coming up underwater.
This is just 9 now. What mastery, though, you know, like, I think that being able to have the knowledge to perform or to mentally piece something together like this is pretty incredible.
Yeah, and a lot of that was actually due to the sound driver they were using. So one of the reasons why a lot of OPL2 music wasn't very good was people just didn't take the time to really learn the ins and outs of the chip. Like maybe they write a pretty good tune, right? But they'll use like stock patches from whatever library or whatever tool they're using. But they actually,
be honest, the percussion, the built-in percussion mode, like, is not that good.
No, not really, especially on the OPL2. But they went through the trouble of creating a custom music system for this one called the Herbulot Adlib system, which was created by Cryo co-founder Remi Herbulot, or Herbulot, I don't know how to pronounce that exactly, with help from Stéphane Picq. So they actually made sure that they had something that gave them access to all of those funky little commands. And that's why KGB and Dune are some of the most expressive OPL2 soundtracks of the time. You know, it was used in Dune, KGB, and Mega Race. Later on versions, I think it was more towards like CD audio, but some of their earlier games were using this FM sound system. And this is something interesting. Picq said this about the driver. I designed HERAD because the existing software didn't take advantage of all the sound parameters and were very poor in expressiveness, the only dynamic being volume of notes. Basically, in HERAD, several individual parameters of the sound patches, like volume of operators, can be modulated individually by velocity, mod wheel, or aftertouch, like a real synth. We also used some hidden parameters not documented by Adlib, but mentioned in the Yamaha technical notice of the YM3812 FM chip. So they basically were like reading over the technical specs to figure out how every bit worked to understand if they could get the full
because
character out of this.
Like a person that would be like, oh, I'll just take what I can get. He, you know, based on what we were saying earlier, it seems like, hey, like, I want this instrument that, like, literally like 3 people play in the world. I want to make it on, you know, on the OPL2. How do we do that? I do want to backtrack 1 second here. You mentioned HERAD, and that is the kind of abbreviation for the Herbulot Adlib system. So if that wasn't clear.
Yeah, it's sort of a half acronym, you know. So
right.
HERAD, like Herbulot Adlib, yeah. So it's kind of interesting because it was designed, not only was it designed to be really expressive, it was also multi-platform. So it mostly used MIDI style controls, so you could write to it and play to it with keyboards and things, I imagine, or at least that was sort of the intent. And it supported a number of platforms, actually. So you had the standard OPL2, which was heard on Dune and KGB, MT32, which we're going to hear from in just a little bit, and OPL3, or Adlib Gold, which was used to great effect on Dune. So if you want to check out episode 81 for an example of that, or just look up Dune Adlib Gold, it sounds fantastic. You got stereo, richer sounds.
You were the one that played Dune on that episode,
I was,
right?
Yeah. But that's the only game that really does it. So, like, this is a guy who not only like mastered a chip that most people didn't do, he also used the OPL3, which almost nobody even bothered supporting, and made this really awesome soundtrack for it just because he wanted to take full advantage.
He put all that effort into the OPL3 and then nobody used it. He's like, okay, screw it. I'm going to Madagascar.
And also, finally, the OPN2, or the 2612. This was, when I said it was used in Mega Race, the Sega CD still had the Genesis sound chip in it. So that was pretty much all he used for the music for that game. So this sound driver, you could output to all of those different formats, which is pretty cool and probably took a lot of work.
Yeah. Yep. Remi Herbulot.
Yeah. Must have been a really good programmer.
Smart dude.
Yeah.
So yeah, earlier Gene mentioned the MT32. We haven't listened to anything from it yet, but it's actually got some pretty standout tracks. So this next one we're going to hear is Paradise, and we really, really like this one. This is using the Roland MT32 sound hardware, composed by Stéphane Picq. right, that was Paradise using the Roland MT32 hardware, composed by Stéphane Picq for the DOS version of KGB.
Yeah, that is I love that ringing telephone sound in there.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, very bureaucratic there.
This track is very MT32 sounding. I mean, it's very, very MIDI sounding. But, I think it works for this track. It's kind of got this this kind of darker vibe to it. The instruments are bright sounding, but they sound very clean, which we have known to expect from the MT32. We know all these patches, we know these instruments. And so I think that there's nothing really unexpected as far as the instrumentation goes. But I think that the use of those instruments and where they emphasize, or where he's emphasizing certain notes and certain sounds, is still a very amazing quality that he has.
We've talked a lot about how the OPL2 has some pretty cool technical tricks, and while it doesn't have that, it still sounds pretty good on the hardware. And I mean, it's probably, he didn't have to do that, right? He probably could have just left it as the FM stuff and called it a day. But
hey, man, someone just paid $900 for their MT32 or whatever. They better get some damn sound out of this thing that's not just OPL2, right? So
That's true. Yeah, this is another one where MT32 only has 4 tracks. So if you want the full experience, you still got to have that Adlib. But
yeah,
it's. I actually don't find most of these tracks super amazing, but this was my favorite of the 4 by far. I thought it sounded really good.
Yeah. I mean, me too. I mean, the OPL2 is where it shines, obviously. But the MT32 stuff, I think is super fun to listen to. The Amiga stuff is also pretty incredible. I think, and it's different, but it's noteworthy for sure.
Yeah, different great flavors. Yeah, lots of same tunes, different flavors.
Anyway, so KGB is a very strange game for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this before. It's kind of an odd choice for subject matter, not in the sense that people don't like political intrigue. I mean, there's a place for it, but
I would expect maybe something like this from an American game company. Just based on the whole American, Russian tensions, Cold War tensions. But no, a French company, right? So that's another oddity, I think, right there.
Yeah, and I don't know if I was reading the releases right, but it looked like it didn't release in France until the later CD-ROM release. So they intended it to come to the US first. So I don't know if it was just a fascination with the Soviet Union, generally in the whole world, or what, who the market was for this. I don't know. It's that aspect on its own.
The Americans, they hate the Russians. Yeah, let's release this game.
But and here's the other part. It was released in the same year as Doom.
My horrible French accent. Sorry. Yeah, I know. It was released the same year. It was they didn't have enough to work on, so they worked on 2 pretty heavy lifting games side by side.
But that's what's crazy to me. They released Dune, and Dune had support for 3 different sound sources. It's including the Adlib Gold, and they also tried to do kind of the same thing, but they cut back a little bit, probably because they expected it to be less successful. But here's what's kind of weird, right? Dune got this album called Spice Opera, which was a reorchestrated album with live instruments. And that came about because the art director, Philippe Ulrich, was so taken with the soundtrack. He's like, Virgin Records, you guys have to put an album out for the soundtrack. And that was an opportunity for them to revisit it. They had one planned for KGB, technically. I found this note on VGM Rips. Kaminari, who ripped the Adlib version of this, said that there was a hint at this reorchestrated album called Rave Age. That's actually in the original DOS version. If you load it up, there's this text that says, look out for the soundtrack coming. And the CD master was ready, apparently, according to Stéphane Picq, but Virgin decided against it. So
somebody has a copy somewhere.
Yeah, so they wanted it to be as big as Dune, but they also kind of set themselves up for failure in a way. So that's kind of disappointing that I can't hear it, because I really want to hear the reorchestrated Dune soundtrack is great. You should definitely.
It just doesn't make any sense to me. Why? Was it just not in their budget to do any marketing for it? I mean, they had already done it. They'd already done all the work.
I guess they just figured nobody was going to buy the CD for.
Maybe the game didn't sell very well at that point, and they're like, we're not going to waste our time.
Yeah, game music from the hit game KGB based on the collapsing Soviet Union. Like, yeah, all the kids are going to rush out and grab that.
Yeah.
I guess.
They're
right
clamoring for that.
It sits right next to the Chrono Trigger albums, you know? No, I mean, there's other little things too. Like, technically, there's support for Adlib Gold, the OPL3 chip, but it doesn't do anything with it. So I don't know. I feel like they wanted this game to be more than it was, but just time limits or whatever just kind of quashed those
even
plans.
To this day, is it worth going back to? I mean, maybe.
Maybe.
I think there might be something there. If you like point and click adventures, then don't let us deter you from giving it a shot, because I think there's something there for people who really want to read an interesting story. I mean, at that point, there's nothing that's, spy espionage and cover-ups and conspiracies like that, the kind of stuff. Like, there's an audience for it, right? Just apparently not much. So
if you're tired of all those fun classic adventure games, just play one that's really frustrating and kind of boring.
Yeah, and a bit bland. Speaking of bland, we talked about the scenery being a little bit lackluster, but I think that's almost because they try to make it too realistic. Like, when I think of Russia, I don't think of a ton of color. I think of a lot of browns, a lot of snow, and a lot of browns.
Well, this game does take place in summertime, so you at least get the fuller range of colors. It's not just like white and brown and gray, but you're not far off. The game color palette is pretty. It goes towards those earth tones a lot.
Yeah, and you know what? Like, I gotta say too, the art style is very interesting. It's not done by like an American artist, right? So it doesn't have a lot of the same maybe facial feature, or not facial features, but like facial animations that you would expect to see from like Gabriel Knight, for example. I'm using that as kind of like a reference for this right now, but the proportions are a little bit strange. I think that they purposely made like the Russians look a little bit more intimidating than Russian people really are.
I mean, it's a KGB after all, so I get that. They're very accented, like brow, and like when they talk, their eyebrows kind of shift around, and like their jawline moves. There's a lot of facial movement that's like makes them look a little bit like grittier than maybe they would be, So yeah, very serious. A lot of serious faces throughout the game.
Yeah, nobody looks happy.
Yeah,
nobody looks happy. Those guards in uniform, they just look like they're yelling at everybody all the time. That said, there's like people with smiley happy faces on the wall. No, I'm just kidding. They're all like upset too.
Yeah, nobody's happy in this game.
Nobody's happy in this game, but it makes it sound like it's a really bad game. But I don't think.
I feel like it has an interesting character. I think it's just a really tough sell. Honestly, I feel like it's.
If you look at screenshots, it just looks like you're peering through like maybe like an old folks' home or something. Through like computer graphics of the early 90s. Again, I don't think we're selling this game.
No, just stick with the music, get the most out of that, and
so if the next track.
Yeah, let's move it along.
Let's keep moving along. This is Gulag, composed by Stéphane Picq for the OPL2.
That was Gulag, composed by Stéphane Picq for KGB, and that was the OPL2 version.
There's something in this track that I love so much. It's that section where everything, all the percussion kind of drops out. Again, a lot of interesting instruments kind of going on, a little repetitive in the beginning, but that's kind of part of his style where it's almost, you know what he reminds me of? He reminds me of a slowed down Jesper Kite.
I can see that, yeah, for sure.
You know, a lot of his music has these very like experimental aspects to it that are that remind me a lot of Kite stuff, but just at a half speed. You know what I mean? And just a little bit more like a bounce and lounge sound to it. But that spot where the percussion drops out and you get it's almost like what I feel like he's emulating an orchestra where just the strings are playing like this back and forth.
Yeah.
And then like out of nowhere, like a spotlight hits this like electric guitar player and he's just I like that a lot. I think that's so cool.
Yeah,
it's a nice contrast.
I think that's my favorite part of the song. And I actually, towards the end of that part, I was getting more like an accordion sound, like in the sense of the tone of the instrument, which is kind of hard to pull off on the OPL2. So props for getting this like really like for a second there, you kind of forget that you're listening to FM.
Yeah. No, and I get that too, because it's not really like a grungy electric guitar. There's not a lot of like reverb or distortion on it. But then like halfway through that solo, it just turns into like a almost like a polka solo, so I do get that that kind of accordion vibe too. But really cool track. That actually kind of wraps up the show. We went on pretty long for this. So hopefully you guys are sticking with us and still listening. Today we covered KGB or Conspiracy on DOS and the Amiga version, composed by Stéphane Picq, with the ported sound over to the Amiga, or the unique track that we heard by Alexandre Ekian. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Yeah, if you want more on the show, check us out online at pixelatedaudio.com for show notes and the track list. And we can also be found on Twitter at pixelatedaudio.
Yes, if you want to leave comments on this episode, if you like the show, you like what you hear, you hate us, I mean, whatever you want, leave us some feedback. We always appreciate that, and we always take the time to read everything. We might not always reply to you immediately, but everything we read, and Gene and I discuss everything. Like we get recommendations and like suggestions, and hey guys, just want to say I really like what you're doing or something. That is so important to us. So we really appreciate everybody's comments thus far. If you want to chat with us and another group of awesome like-minded people, come into our Discord and come chat with us and everybody else in there. There's a lot of just wonderful people that are just as passionate about video game music as we are, and so we'd appreciate if you check it out.
Yeah, and you're going to find all sorts of game music posted. It doesn't matter how knowledgeable you are. There's always something that comes through that you've never heard of. I think that's my favorite part of the Discord is like,
yep. I
consider myself like pretty well versed, and somebody's like, this is brand new to me. I don't know this composer. I don't know this game. Exactly. Sometimes I don't even know the system.
Yeah.
So
I do want to also give a shout out to VGM Rips. We talked about Kaminati, who did some extra research on this. And so we appreciate that, and very sample accurate rips that we can play that are very high quality, and that community there. If you ever want to learn about ripping, there is a channel within our server. A lot of the VGM Rips folks are there, and you can come chat with them. They can provide a lot of insight. So definitely check it out. And also VGMRips.net.
Yeah. And, as our resident OPL2 lover, I'm going to promote a few of our past episodes. So if you can't get enough of that OPL2 sound, check out some of these ones. 125, Harold Hardtooth, our mascot. unofficially. Episode 76, Outzone with Tatsuya Uemura. That's, I think, an arcade game, right? And it uses 3812.
Yep. Outzone, yeah. And
episode 63, Illusion Blaze with Sehung No. That is a Korean PC game, I believe.
Yes. Yep.
So,
that's actually one of my favorite soundtracks of all time, using the OPL2.
Yeah, there's like a whole subset of Korean PC games I'd like to shine a little bit more of a spotlight on, either in expansion packs or in other episodes. Of course, yeah.
That's the idea. We have a lot of recommendations that we're going to try to get through in the rest of this disaster of a year, but we got some good stuff coming. So keep an eye out on the feed. We have one more track taken out the show. This is called The Machine, composed by Stéphane Picq. This is also using the OPL2. It's a really awesome track. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you back in a few weeks for the next episode.